Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Jeff Allied, and thanks for being with us. Today, I'm joined by our elections team to help me break down our top 15 races to watch next week. With thousands of federal, state, and local elections around the country, well, it's pretty tall order to just try and pick a handful to highlight. And of course, you know the obvious ones, so we didn't want to just pick the 15 most obvious, most important elections. So, we're not necessarily saying these are the most important 15 elections, but they're just kind of a combination of 15 interesting and important and just kind of unique elections that our team thought might be fun and worthwhile to discuss and share. So rather than hear me just talk through them all, we've got a bunch of guests on the show. I'm excited to introduce them to you today. So let's get right on into it. First, from our election team, Briana Ryan. Hey, Briana.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Jeff.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for being here. And Ethan Sorell. Ethan, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me as well.
Yep. And finally, Lara Bonatesta. All right, well, let's dive right on in. So first and foremost, let's talk a little bit about how do we even pick these races? I mean, obviously, whittling it down to 15 is kind of an impossible tall order. Think of it like, some of those universities that get 20,000 applicants and they're only going to accept 500 of them. They're going to accept 500 and the next 500 were equally qualified. So we could do a top 1,000 races list, but we picked 15. So Briana, tell us a little bit about the methodology behind that.
Yeah, so like you said, I wish I could pick the top 50, but we had to stick to 15. As we were putting this list together with our editorial department, we really aimed to have a mix of federal, state, and local races. And ultimately, the list includes races for Congress, state executive offices, state legislators, and state Supreme Court judgeships. And we considered a number of factors as we were putting this list together, such as past election results, election race ratings from independent forecasters, and unique election-specific circumstances, so like rematches.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks. So we're going to have some fun with this episode. If you already listened to our ballot measures top episode, you heard Ryan and Nicole and I talk through our top 15 ballot measures, and we kind of cheated a little and crammed more than 15 ballot measures into our list because we found sort of unique rules around that. So today we'll have a little bit of fun, and we're going to kind of treat this like a sort of around the horn type of a process where I'm just going to pick Ethan, Lara, and Briana, and they're going to talk through the various races I think are interesting, touch on historical trends, polling, sort of key factors ongoing. So let's dive right in. And who wants to go first?
I'll go first.
Awesome. Briana. Okay. What's your first pick?
I'm going to highlight some of the congressional races that we're looking at this year. So starting off with the Senate, we have two races on our list. One that I find really interesting is the race between third-term incumbent Sherrod Brown and Bernie Moreno. So this race has consistently been on everybody's to-watch list, and this is definitely no different, and it deserves that. It has consistently been rated a toss-up by independent forecasters. It's also, Brown is one of 3 Democratic senators in a state that Trump won in 2020. And Ohio is one of 5 states with a split Senate delegation. So they have one senator from one party and another from another party.
Well, I think that won't be the only Senate race on our list, but there's a lot there. Thanks, Briana. Okay, we're going to go alphabetical then. Ethan, what's your pick?
Sure. I'll go with the Arizona state legislature. So the Arizona legislature is one of our battleground state legislatures that we're following across the country. And one of the reasons I think this is a particularly interesting election season to watch in Arizona is because of the partisan composition in both the Arizona House and the Arizona Senate, where just 2 seats represent the Republicans and Democrats in both chambers. So Democrats have not controlled either legislative chamber since 1992. But because Arizona enacted new legislative maps following the 2020 census, and this will be the first election season under new maps, it'll be interesting to see whether Democrats gain seats and flip either chamber or Republicans hold on to their majorities in both chambers. Interestingly, Arizona is one of 10 divided governments nationwide, so this will impact various policy issues on how Governor Katie Hobbs can either implement legislation or be forced to use her veto in certain cases.
Yeah, listeners to the prior shows have heard me talk quite a bit about the interesting dynamic with Arizona's state government right now and how that divided government led to a large volume of ballot measures because the Republican legislature couldn't get certain policies they wanted enacted past Governor Hobbs' veto. So they put things directly before voters with legislatively referred ballot measures, which we'll see the result of sometime next week. So yeah, Ethan, great. Thanks, Arizona. It'll be a really interesting election next week. Okay, Lara, you're up next. What's your choice?
I want to be talking about a couple of state executive races today, but I think I'll start with the New Hampshire gubernatorial election. This race is really interesting. On the Democrat side, you have former Manchester Mayor Joyce Craig. And on the Republican side, you have former U.S. Senator and former Attorney General Kelly Ayotte. The Republican incumbent, Chris Sununu, isn't running for re-election, and this is the first time that the governor's election has been open since he was elected back in 2016. So that definitely creates an interesting dynamic. This election is particularly interesting because out of the 11 gubernatorial elections happening this year, it's the only one that's been consistently rated as a toss-up by the major election forecasters. And so there's a lot of really interesting things to watch. One of those things is polling. They've been polling very close, sometimes at a tie. And so, yeah.
The vast majority of governorships are up for election during midterm election cycles. And New Hampshire is one of the few states that has 2-year terms for its governorship. So the good folks in New Hampshire are getting to vote on a new governor every 2 years. So great. Briana, back to you then in our little draft. What's next?
Yeah, so the next race that I really have an eye on, moving on to our House, we have 5 races on our list. And something that I noticed while looking over that list is that all 5 of those races include a first-term incumbent, and there are 3 rematches from 2022. So one of those races that I think really exemplifies those trends that we saw there is Washington's 3rd Congressional District between Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez, the Democrat, and Joe Kent, the Republican. So this was a Republican-held seat that Democrats won back in 2022, and it's also a Democratic-held district that Donald Trump won in 2020. All our independent forecasters have given it toss-ups, with one rating it lean Republican. And back in the 2022 race, Gluesenkamp-Perez actually won by 0.8 of a percentage point. So extremely thin margin there. So it'll be interesting to see how this rematch plays out.
Yeah, one of the closest elections last cycle. And we've had quite a few rematches this cycle. I think 75, if I remember my count right, which is quite a bit more than the number of rematches we saw in 2022 and 2020. So those races are always pretty interesting because the voters in those districts have already seen that matchup before. And it's a really interesting sort of comparison over time to see the trend there. So great. Thanks, Briana. Okay, Ethan, who's your next pick?
For my next pick, I'm going to choose the Michigan House of Representatives. So similar to in Arizona, where 2 seats separated both Republicans and Democrats in each chamber, that's also the case in Michigan. But in Michigan, Democrats have a 2-seat majority in both chambers, both the House and the Senate. But in the Michigan Senate, they're not holding elections this year. The next time they're holding elections is in 2026. So only the Michigan House of Representatives is up for election. And in Michigan, Democrats currently have a trifecta control of the state legislature, meaning the governor is a Democrat, Democratic Governor Gretchen Whitmer, and they also control both the House and the Senate. So during the first 6 years of Whitmer's term, she had a Republican majority in both chambers of the legislature, and only the past 2 years have Democrats controlled both chambers. So this election will really determine if moving forward in Whitmer's term, she'll have a Democratic legislature to work with, or a Republican legislature as she did in her first 6 years in office.
Got it. Yeah, thanks, Ethan. Michigan, always an interesting state, and listeners will remember that state flipped 2 years ago where they had their first election using new maps that came out of a redistricting ballot measure passed in 2018. And the Democrats had a trifecta, as Ethan said, over the past 2 years, which certainly allowed for a different set of policy agendas than Whitmer was able to enact when there was a divided government. So, awesome. Thanks, Ethan. All right. We are continuing our circle here. Lara, you're up again.
So next I'm going to talk about the Michigan Supreme Court elections. These are particularly interesting this year because the partisan balance of the court is at stake. 2 out of 7 seats on the court are up for election this year. Currently, Democrats have a 4-3 majority, and of the seats that are up, one is currently held by a Democrat and the other is currently held by a Republican. So if Democrats win both seats, they would expand their majority to 5-2, but if Republicans win both seats, they would win a 4-3 majority. Some other interesting things just to note here is that Democrats won control of the court in 2020, and in 2022, they were able to hold control of the court with one Democratic candidate winning and one Republican candidate winning in those elections. And you've got 4 candidates running here. And one thing I want to note is that Michigan Supreme Court elections are officially nonpartisan, but the candidates are nominated through a party convention process. So for Democrats, you've got incumbent Kyra Harris Bolden and Kimberly Thomas running. And then for Republicans, you've got Patrick O'Grady and Andrew Fink running.
Yeah, that Michigan nominating process is really so interesting. I mean, for you voters who don't live in, or listeners who don't live in Michigan, you got to picture this experience. If you're voting in the primary, you are seeing candidates in a nominating process with a party label next to their name. And in a primary, you're selecting between candidates. When you get to the general election, though, you are not seeing the party identification next to the name. It's a nonpartisan general election following a partisan primary. So it's a pretty unique judicial nominating process. On Ballotpedia here, we call it the Michigan judicial nominating process because it's pretty unique. But yeah, that's one of a handful of courts, and I suspect we'll circle back with another court later on. So great. Let's switch things up a bit and go in reverse order here. And Lara, pick another race. Now we'll stay with you here.
Sure. So the other race that I want to talk about is the North Carolina Attorney General race. One of the things that I think is really interesting about this race is just who the candidates are. They are both pretty well-known members of the U.S. House. You've got Democrat Jeff Jackson and Republican Dan Bishop running. They're both pretty much running along their party lines. Jackson has said that he wants to focus on fentanyl, on scammers, on corporations polluting water, and Bishop is very much running on a law and order kind of platform. And so one of the interesting things to note here is that this is one of the elections that determines North Carolina's triplex status. So that's the governor, the secretary of state, and the attorney general. And currently all 3 of those are Democrats, but we covered all of those as battlegrounds this year. I think another thing to note here is that Democrats have held the office of the attorney general for over 100 years in North Carolina. The last time a Republican was elected was in 1896. And the current attorney general is running for governor, and the current governor is also a former attorney general. And so it's kind of seen as a stepping stone to governor as well.
Yeah, North Carolina is one of those really interesting states, Laura, where we see battlegrounds where voters will at times split their tickets in statewide elections. So then you end up with a cabinet that is elected that has voters sometimes picking candidates from different parties, even though they're running in the same election. So always pretty interesting to see how that plays out. So great. All right, back over to Ethan again.
Okay, so for my last pick, I'm going to go with the Alaska legislative elections. Right now, Republicans have majorities in both chambers of the Alaska legislature, but one thing that makes Alaska particularly interesting is that majority coalitions in both chambers, consisting of Republicans and Democrats, control the chambers. So members of the Alaska House formed multi-partisan majority coalitions after every election since 2016. Republicans won a majority of seats in all 4 of those election years, and the coalitions that formed after the 2016, 2018, and 2020 elections all included Democratic majorities, while the coalition that formed after the 2022 election included a Republican majority. Another interesting point to note is that all 4 majority coalitions have included members of what's called the Bush Caucus, which is a group of Democratic and independent legislators representing 4 northern rural districts in Alaska. The Bush Caucus has influenced Alaska politics for more than 5 decades because its members have frequently put regional interests above those just pertaining to party loyalty, and their willingness to cross the partisan aisle has frequently given them outsized power in the Capitol. So it'll be interesting to see how the partisan composition in conjunction with the multi-partisan majority coalition sort of turns out after the election results.
politics being local, of course, the issues in Alaska are certainly very unique. And Alaska uses ranked choice voting, and they will be using ranked choice voting while at the same time voters will be voting on a ballot measure related to repealing ranked choice voting. So if you listen to our top 15 ballot measures episode, you can learn a heck of a lot more, listeners, about the ranked choice voting ballot measure in Alaska and throughout the rest of the country. Thanks, Ethan. Okay, Briana, back to you again.
Okay, so next up, still sticking with the U.S. House, my next election to watch is Oregon's 5th Congressional District. This race is between incumbent Republican Lori Chavez DeRemer and Democrat Janelle Bynum. This was a Democratic-held seat that Republicans won back in 2022, and it's also a Republican-held district that Biden won in 2020. Our 4 independent forecasters have consistently rated this as a toss-up. And this actually is not the first time that these two candidates have faced each other in an election. They have previously faced each other in Oregon State House elections. So in those 2 previous elections, Bynum defeated Chavez DeRemer. And obviously, legislative districts and congressional districts have different lines. But it'll be interesting to see how that dynamic plays out in this election.
Yeah, it's one of those rematches that you don't see too often. It'd be like, 2 boxers who fought each other, and the junior middle school championship. And then all of a sudden, 10 years later, they're in some heavyweight battle. So we don't see this kind of rematch very often. All right, well, we certainly didn't cover every election, but you can learn all about the other races we covered in our Top 15 report by clicking the link in the show notes or checking it out on ballotpedia.org. We'll have lots more information about these elections in the coming days ahead, and of course, you can follow along with the results of these elections and races on Ballotpedia throughout next week as the results and returns are coming in. So, Ethan, Lara, and Briana, thanks so much for coming on the show today, and enjoy your snack box over the next week.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
And for our listeners, you can learn more about our election coverage at the link in our show notes. We'll be back Monday with another episode. You can expect On the Ballot to be coming at you pretty much daily through election season. We're almost there with the latest news and developments. So please make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Jeff Palais, and thanks for listening.